The history of Afrocentrism. I'm often asked the question by many people who contact me, why is the black man in America, the Afro-American, hated so much by everyone else around the world? The answer to this question is quite simple. The African American is hated because of the fact that the African American is indigenous to the United States, and he is only one of many black people that have been the participants in the creation of a beautiful world history. They hate Afro-Americans because Afro-Americans were the first researchers in the world to challenge European hegemony of history. It was African American scholars who began to say that other people, black and brown people, had a history. That these people in Africa, Europe, and the Americas, they had a history prior to their meeting the Europeans. And this has upset many Europeans because of the fact that they can no longer maintain the myth that African people, black people, don't have a history. My name is Dr. Clyde Winters. I've been writing about Afrocentric history for over 40 years. Afro-American scholars have met the standards of scholarship for almost 200 years, supporting the role of blacks in ancient history. During this period, Eurocentric researchers have attempted to whiten blacks from history. In the books and articles below, I provide a detailed explanation of how to use the genetic model to study ancient African and black civilizations. Knowledge is cumulative. Knowledge is used when you teach educational philosophy on occasion at university. I taught education for many years at several universities in the United States. In my educational philosophy classes, I just didn't talk about contemporary educators. I had to talk about the Greek philosophers. Because much of the education that we teach and the way we teach to our students is based upon what the Greek philosophers had implied. Afrocentrism is a mature social science that was founded by Afro-Americans almost 200 years ago. These men and women provided scholarship based on contemporary archaeological and historical research that led to recognition of the African black origination of civilizations throughout the world. These Afro-American scholars, mostly trained at Harvard University, one of the few universities that admitted blacks in the 19th and early 20th century, provide the scientific basis, the global role played by African people in civilizing the world. Afrocentrism and the anthropological study of ancient black civilizations began by Afro-Americans. The foundation of any mature science is its articulation in an authoritative text. The anthropological textbooks published by Hopkins, Perry, and Williams provide the vocabulary themes for further Afrocentric social science research. The pedagogy for ancient anthropological research was well established by the end of the 19th century by Afro-American researchers well versed in the classical languages and knowledge of Greek and Latin. Cornish and Roscoe, as early as 1827, in the Freedom Journal, which they published, were the first African Americans to discuss and explain the ancient model of history. These Afrocentric social scientists used the classics to prove that blacks founded civilization in Egypt, Ethiopia, Babylonia, and Nineveh. Cornish and Rush from 1827 made it clear that archaeological research supported the classical or ancient model of history. Edward Blyton also used classical sources to discuss the ancient history of African people. In his works, he not only discussed the evidence for blacks in West Asia and Egypt, he also discussed the role of blacks in ancient America. By 1883, anthropological researchers began to publish books on African American history. G.W. Williams in 1883 wrote the first textbook on African American history. In the history of the Negro race in America, Dr. Williams provides the schema for all future Africological history texts. Dr. Williams' 1883 confirmed the classical traditions for blacks founding civilizations in both Africa, Egypt and Ethiopia, and West Asia, in addition to confirming the ancient model of history. Dr. Williams' 1883 also mentioned the presence of blacks in Indochina and the Malay Peninsula. Dr. Williams was trained at Howard University. A decade later, R.L. Perry, in 1893, also presented evidence to confirm the classical traditions of blacks founding Egypt, Greece, and the Mesopotamian civilization. He also provided empirical evidence for the role of blacks in Phoenicia, thus increasing the scope of the ancient study of African history paradigms. The interesting thing about these researchers is that they used the contemporary literature. They used up-to-date literature that they found relating to these black civilizations that existed in the time when they wrote their works. Pauline E. Hopkins in 1905 added further articulation of the African history curriculum. The paradigms of the application of these things was understanding the roles of blacks in West Asia and Africa. Hopkins in 1905 provided further confirmation of the role of blacks in Southeast Asia and explained the scope of Africological research relating to blacks in China. This review of the 19th century Africological social scientific research indicates confirmation of the ancient model for the early history of blacks. We also see a movement away from self-published Africological research and publication of research and the publication of research articles on Afrocentric themes in many textbooks. It was in these books that the paradigms associated with the ancient model and African study of ancient history were confirmed and given reliability by empirical research. It was these texts which provide the pedagogical vehicles for the perpetuation of the Africological normal social science. The Afrocentric textbooks of Hopkins, Perry, and Williams provided the reliable and validity of the ancient history paradigms. The discussion of these texts of contemporary scientific research findings, providing the existence of ancient civilizations in Egypt, Nubia, the Sudan or Kush, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and North Africa, lent congruency to the classical literature which pointed to the existence of these civilizations and these African origins of these civilizations, especially the Kushites, the so-called children of Ham. The authors of the Africological textbooks reported the latest archaeological and anthropological findings. The archaeological findings reported in these textbooks added precision to their analysis of the classical and Old Testament literature. This, along with the discovery of artifacts on the ancient sites depicting black African people, proved that the classical and Old Testament literature, as opposed to the Aryan model, objectively identified the black African role in ancient history. And finally, these textbooks confirm that any examination of references in the classical literature to blacks in Egypt, Kush, Mesopotamia, and Greece and Crete exhibited constancy to the evidence recovered from archaeological excavations in the Middle East and the Aegean. They in turn disconfirmed the Aryan model, which proved to be a falsification of the authentic history of blacks in early history. Black people created history. It was black people who were the history makers. The creation of the Africological textbooks provide us with a number of facts revealing the nature of the Afrocentric history paradigms. This is very important. Afrocentrism, when it is done properly, is a curriculum that has paradigms that help us to be able to understand the role of blacks in ancient history. These paradigms are: 1, artifacts depicting blacks found in ancient sites recovered through archaeological excavation. Paradigm number 2, the confirmation of the validity of classical and Old Testament references to blacks as founders of civilization in Africa and Asia. 3, the present of isolated pockets of blacks existing outside Africa. And 4, that the contemporary Arab people in modern Egypt are not the descendants of the ancient Egyptians. These 4 facts is the basis of Afrocentrism. These 4 facts allow us to investigate and understand the ancient history of black people. The early Africological textbooks also outline the Africological themes research should endeavor to study. As a result, the data collected by the Africological ancient history research pioneers led to the development of 3 facts by the end of the 19th century, which need to be solved by the Afrocentric paradigms. You see, in other words, in a sense, any science is based upon paradigms. Any science, and in fact every science, has a foundation. And Afrocentrism is a science. These facts that came from the research of these great African pioneers was, number 1, look at and discover what is the exact relationship of ancient Egypt to blacks in other parts of Africa. Number 2, how and when did blacks settle America, Asia, and Europe? Number 3, what are the contributions of blacks to the rise and cultural expression of ancient black African civilizations? And number 4, that Africans settled parts of American ancient times. These people are not talking about these things just today. Whenever people attack Afrocentrism, they talk about the fact that black people are making up things. Why are they making up these things? Why is it different? I want to tell you. Afro-American scholars have been researching these topics for 200 years. This isn't nothing new. This isn't no pie in the sky. No flippant start. This is a detailed discussion of African people and their history. As you can see, Afro-Americans have been writing about the global history of ancient black civilizations for almost 200 years. It was Afro-Americans who first mentioned the African civilization of West Africa and the black roots of Egypt. These Afro-Americans made Africa a historical part of the world. Do you understand that? Before Afro-Americans began to conduct their research, write their books, do their articles, people did not believe Africans had any civilization at all. They believed that African people had sat in a hut and just wailed their times away, cooking fried chicken and eating watermelons. This was a lie. Black people developed the pyramids, and pyramids all over the world. But we didn't know that because of the fact that the Europeans in their hegemony of history, they decided to say that black people had no history. Black people had done nothing but always wait for Europeans to come and lead them. And this was a lie. Afro-American scholars not only highlighted African history, they also discussed African black civilizations developed by African people outside of Africa, over 100 years before Burnell and Boas. Your history of what you call Negro-centric or black studies is all wrong. It was Du Bois who founded black Negro studies, especially Afro-American studies, given his work on the slave trade and sociological and historical studies of Afro-Americans. He mentions in The World in Africa about the Jews and other Europeans who were attempting to take over the field, but it was Afro-Americans that led the way. It was Afro-Americans that proved that African people, black people, had a history. There's no one who can deny the fact that Leo Hansberry founded African studies in the United States. Not the Jews. Hansberry was a professor at Howard University. Hansberry was the first one to do research on the Cushites. Hansberry was the first one to say that black people contributed to the rise of Egypt. Moreover, Burnell did not initiate any second wave of Negro black-centric study for ancient Egyptian civilization. Credit for this social science push is none other than Sheikh Anta Diop, who makes it clear that he was influenced by Du Bois. Did you know that? We hear a lot about Anta Diop, but nobody mentions the fact that Anta Diop got his leads on blacks in Egypt from W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the greatest scholars, Afro-American scholars of his age. There are 4 philosophical schools associated with the Afrocentric study of ancient history. These schools would be called perennialists, essentialists, existentialists, and progressivists. The taxonomic system we use to classify the various Afrocentric philosophical positions and related values affecting Afrocentrism are modeled on philosophical developments associated with education. We can use taxonomies of educational philosophies to discuss any proposed Afrocentric curriculum Because both education and philosophy are cultural experience. I'll repeat. Both education and philosophy are cultural experience. That means they come from the people. They come from your culture. They come from who and what you are. Moreover, because Afrocentrism seeks to explain and delineate the study of African people, it clearly is a field of study which encompasses all aspects of the culture of Black and African people. The perennialist Afrocentrist study the great works. That means in a sense that these were people who spent most of their time looking at the Greco-Roman literature, looking at the Bible, and trying to bring from those great sources which history is founded upon information about Black people. The adherents to the perennialist school include Martin Delany, Cornish and Rushmore, Frederick Douglass, and Edward Blyden. These Afrocentrists see knowledge as truth, which is eternal. The essentialist Afrocentric school emphasizes in their writing data that is well established through scientific research. Afrocentrists of the essentialist philosophical school include W. E. Du Bois, John Jackson, Clyde Winters, and Leo Hansberry. They believe that as new research is published, it should be analyzed to discover how it relates to the ancient history of Black and African people, to enrich our understanding of the past. The essentialist Afrocentrists believe that Africological studies should strive to teach African people to know more about themselves so we can have a better world. The Afrocentric essentialists include J. Rogers, Anti Diop, G.M. James, Marcus Garvey, and A.A. Schomburg. Research is the foundation of good science, or knowing in general. There are 4 methods of knowing. These 4 methods are: 1, the method of tenacity. One holds firmly to the truth because they know it to be true. Number 2, the method of authority. The method of established belief, i.e. the Bible, the expert says it's so, so it must be so. The 3rd method is the method of intuition, the method where a proposition agrees with reason, but not necessarily with experience. And 4, the methods of science, the method of attaining knowledge which calls for self-correction. To explain African origins of the Egyptians, I use the scientific method, which calls for hypothesis testing, not only supported by experimentation, but also that of alternative, plausible hypothesis that may place doubt on the original hypothesis. The aim of science is theory construction. A theory is a set of interrelated constructs, propositions, and definitions that provide a systematic understanding of phenomena by outlining relations among a group of variables that explain and predict phenomena. Scientific inquiry involves issues of theory construction, control, and experimentation. Scientific knowledge must rest on testing rather than mere induction, which can be defined as inferences of laws and generalizations derived from observations. This falsity of logical possibility is evident in the rejection of African origin of the Egyptian. These writers base their theories solely on the observation, and non-scientific knowledge is not science. Karl Popper in The Logic of Scientific Discovery rejects this logic of logical validity, based solely on inferences and conjecture. Popper maintains that confirmation in science is arrived at through falsification. Therefore, to confirm a theory in science, one tests the hypothesis through various attempts at falsification. In falsification, the researcher uses cultural, linguistic, anthropological, and historical knowledge to invalidate a proposed theory. If a theory cannot be falsified through the variables associated with the theory, it is confirmed. It can only be disconfirmed when new generalizations associated with the original theory fail to survive attempts at falsification. In short, science centers on conjecture and refutation. Yes, you have to be able to prove something is wrong, but it has to be testable. Given 200 years of research in Afrocentrism, our job is to confirm the research into the role of blacks in ancient history uncovered by the giants in Afrocentric social science discussed above.